everybody, so today we'll be talking about artificial structures and why they should not be used to create oceanic habitat. This is by myself, Alyssa Leitzel, and Logan Staley. I will be talking about the introduction and background of artificial structures and the ecological perspective, and then Logan will talk about the social and political aspects, and he will finish up with the conclusion. So what are artificial structures, or artificial reefs, as they're most commonly known as? A definition from Konovalenko, 2024. These are man-made structures that are put into the ocean to create marine habitat. So this is the most basic definition. New Haven Reef Conservation Program, 2025, listed a few different things that can be considered artificial reefs. And they can be ships, cars, tires, concrete, train cars, fridges, and then of course, as you can see in this picture that I found on Google, these are constructed boxes. Carr and Hickson, 1997, really stated their purpose, and that's to first enhance the production of reef-associated species, and second, to increase the convenience or efficiency of harvesting reef-associated species. So why are they controversial? So these are the points that we're going to cover in this presentation. First, our artificial reefs promote the colonization of non-indigenous species and or hurt local native biodiversity. They also can harm or destroy natural marine habitats and ecosystems. Artificial reefs don't consider cultural ecosystem services provided by natural resources, and they also are often abandoned when research money is exhausted. So some important definitions that we will use, we'll use these words a lot in our presentation, are non-indigenous versus invasive species. So non-indigenous species are species that are introduced into an area where they did not naturally occur. Invasive species are non-indigenous species that outcompete the native species. In one study that we talk about, Moschella et al. 2005, they use low-crested defense structures, also known as LCS. These are man-made structures that protect the shoreline. These are usually found in soft shore areas from waves and other forms of erosions. So some examples of this would be like seawalls, jetties, breakwaters, and in this picture here, this is called a groin. These structures turn what used to be a soft shore environment into a quote-unquote rocky shore, since it is a hard structure now that exists in a soft shore area. Two different studies that we'll talk about are Heary et al. 2017 and Bishop et al. 2017. As well as one other. They talk about ocean sprawl. So ocean sprawl is the development of shore and offshore areas with man-made structures that alter the ocean's natural environment in a way to promote anthropogenic causes. So basically what that means is ocean sprawl is the addition of more and more artificial structures in the ocean. So like these groins, they are most often paired with seawalls. So as you add more groins and more seawalls, that is what is considered ocean sprawl. And then lastly, cultural ecosystem services. This is defined by Walter et al. 2003. They are the non-material benefits that people obtain from ecosystems through spiritual enrichment, cognitive development, reflection, recreation, and aesthetic experiences. So onto the ecological perspective. Artificial reefs have been used as a way to create habitat for marine life. However, this can be problematic ecologically for many reasons, including but not limited to promoting non-indigenous and invasive species, hurting the native biodiversity, and destroying natural marine habitats that they're trying to mimic. Due to this, it is ecologically better to restore and preserve the natural habitats that already exist than to create new man-made habitats. So one of the biggest reasons why artificial reefs are not the best solution is because they create threats to the local biodiversity. So this study that I looked at, Moschella et al. 2005, they studied the abundance, complexity, and composition of symbiotic communities, also known as epibioses, on LCSs, so those low-crested defense structures, and they compared them to natural rocky shores. They found that the epibioses on both structures were similar in a qualitative form, since they experienced the same physical and biological factors. So basically what that means is they saw similar qualities in the communities that they were looking at because they were experiencing the same kinds of waves, the same temperatures, the same difference in water levels, that kind of thing. However, in a quantitative matter, the LCSs were less diverse and had low species richness. They found that the artificial structures or reefs were not complex enough to host larger colonizations. So if you look at this figure here, this is out of the Moschella et al. 2005 study. The gray bars are the LCS communities, while the white bars are the native rocky shore communities. And as you can see, the white bars are higher, significantly so, on each of the different areas that they looked. So Lyme Regis, Gabiche, Collonges, and Cubelles, those are all different areas, one in the UK, one in Italy, and then 2 in Spain. And you can see that the total number of species is much lower on the artificial structures or the LCSs than they were in the native environment. It is important to note that the LCSs in this study were compared to natural rocky shores. However, LCSs are most often placed in sedimentary and soft shore areas. These areas will most likely have a completely different composition of species compared to their rocky shore counterparts. Another reason why artificial structures might not be the best choice for creating habitat is because of non-indigenous and invasive species threats. So a study by Glasby et al. In 2007 looked into the distributions of native and non-indigenous species on artificial reefs and natural structures. So the artificial structures that they looked at were fiberglass and concrete pontoons, concrete pilings, wood pilings with and without bark, and sandstone seawalls. And then they compared those artificial structures to a natural rocky reef. All of the artificial reefs, except for the sandstone seawall, had significantly higher amounts of non-indigenous species colonized than native species. The sandstone seawall and the rocky reef showed a significant number of native species compared to non-indigenous species. So that's kind of what this graph here is showing. The black bars are non-indigenous species, and the white bars are native species. So as you can see, for fiberglass pontoon, concrete piling, wood piling B, and then wood piling, just wood piling, all of those have significantly higher amounts of non-indigenous species than native species. And then the sandstone seawall and the rocky reef with their white bars, those are the native species. They had much higher native species that colonized versus non-indigenous. These numbers show that artificial reefs are more likely to be occupied by non-indigenous species than native species, indicating that artificial reefs are more likely to promote colonization of these non-indigenous species. So moving on to my second topic of artificial reefs can destroy or harm the native environment. Ocean sprawl and environmental connectivity kind of go hand in hand. So I looked at 2 different studies that looked at the effects of ocean sprawl, and they identified the detrimental effects of artificial reefs on organisms that live in the sediment or that are migratory. Feary et al. 2011 identified the direct and indirect effects of artificial reefs. Directly, placing artificial reefs disrupts the organisms that use the sediment. Additionally, they identified that artificial reefs can disrupt the movement of species. For example, a seawall in an intertidal zone would negatively affect shorebirds that roost and forage in that area. The other study, Bishop et al. 2017, also focused on the indirect effects of ocean sprawl, focusing specifically on the connectivity of the ocean that is lost through the placement of artificial reefs. They highlight that artificial reefs can act as physical barriers that may deter migratory patterns or natural daily movement of species. These movements are critical for some species who need it to forage and hunt for food, or who need different environments at different times of the day, month, or year. So in this graphic, the top 1A, this shows the different types of connectivity that the ocean exhibits, and you can read these little captions at the bottom. But most importantly, B, the second one on the bottom, impacts of artificial structures on connectivity. If you look at these two simultaneously, you'll notice that as artificial structures are placed into the ocean, connectivity is lost for these species that depend on it. So it becomes extremely difficult for species that are moving, whether it's in the ocean, at the shore, in estuaries. Artificial structures are blocking that for them to be able to move.
In this section, we'll be discussing the socio-political perspectives regarding artificial reefs and present alternatives that could better achieve the goals that have been set forth by artificial reefs. According to a global analysis of human settlements in coastal zones by Smalls et al., there is a statistically significant portion of the human population that lives on or within 60 miles of coasts. This is a trend that has repeated across history. Therefore, many cultures have developed complex relationships with reefs and coasts and the ocean. As noted in NunPD 2003, a plethora of creation myths and other folklore of the Pacific Island cultures relate to reefs and the communities that relied on them. More than just physical sustenance, these reefs provided these cultures with a spiritual connection and a cultural identity. In addition to those connections, the indigenous knowledge that is held within these communities, as it relates to conservation and habitat management, spans across thousands of years that these cultures have managed these species and habitats. We have discussed the ecological needs that are not being met by artificial reefs, but in this section we will talk about the cultural and social needs that are not being met by artificial reefs. Artificial reef projects that are aimed at increasing singular metrics related to productivity do not take into consideration the populations that live near these resources. In a literature review by Tessier and et al., they found that over the course of 44 years, the singularly stated principal objective of artificial reefs created around France focused on productivity of recreation and fisheries. As you can see in this graph, over time the overall objectives have changed to focus mostly on productivity of artisanal fishing and fisheries. While these are important aspects of these resources, the complexity of a reef extends far beyond a singular stated goal into the lives of the people who utilize them for a wide range of services. Further, this literature found that a majority of these projects were completed by private companies. This led to a wide range of standards, goals, and outcomes that often did not align with the needs of the communities. As seen in these images, across the 44 years of this literature review, these are just some of the types of artificial structures that were used. These private companies were mostly paid to increase productivity for a single type of fish in a fishery throughout the region. So you can see through here the difference in materiality, shape, design. They aren't using a strategic master plan when they're developing these and end up maybe only focusing on one species, two species. So in a study by Pliger et al., done across a cross-section of villages in Germany around a regionally important lake. They were trying to find what the individually held intrinsic and extrinsic values of natures were. They gave out a two-page survey that the participants filled out, and the results of the survey are found here on the sheet. The survey found that only a minority of the people in the area around the subject lake are concerned with the consumptive uses of nature. As seen in the summary graph, the leading reported values are around intangible cultural ecosystem services, rather than consumptive or recreational use. This shows that in aggregate and at scale, if we were to scale up the results of this survey and potentially survey more people, we could show that people are more concerned with the cultural ecosystem services that are provided by natural resources. A cultural ecosystem service was defined by Walter V. Reed et al. In 2003 as a non-material benefit that people obtain from the ecosystem through spiritual enrichment, cognitive development, reflection, recreation, and aesthetic experiences. So now I would like to present you with a case study of an alternative, a better way that productivity, recreation can be enhanced while at the same time providing for a community-based restoration and conservation, for community uplift, and natural diversity increases. So at the root of this debate is the fact that reefs around the world are in danger of environmental degradation and are a great source of biodiversity loss. As an alternative to artificial reefs, investment in community-based restoration of reefs that already exist and conservation of those reefs should be made. This method not only provides the much-needed ecological protection, but additionally satisfies the human need for connection with nature and can help rebuild community at the same time. A study was completed of a community-based coral reef restoration project by Kittinger et al. The project was aimed at restoring a culturally significant coral reef on Oahu that was experiencing degradation due to an invasive algae called mudweed. This restoration project brought together researchers, community leaders, and indigenous knowledge to restore a habitat of cultural and ecological importance. This study looked at the cultural ecosystem services and additional socioeconomic outcomes that investment in community-based restoration can have. They found, throughout this study, they found that community awareness of environmental issues increased, knowledge sharing between tribal elders and younger generations of the indigenous culture increased. The engagement with the tribal cultural centers also increased. People were interested in learning what they had to say, and the engagement between the multiple generations just strengthened those bonds and strengthened that information sharing. Additionally, on a economic side of things, over 251 individuals were positively financially impacted by the funding of the Pono Pacific employees that were engaged on this project. 25 full-time jobs were created by the project, 27 part-time positions, and support positions that were outsourced to community groups brought the total jobs created by this to 63, with 25 full-time positions. So while the original objective of restoration of a cultural resource such as this was successful, as seen by this map here, the original intent was to restore this reef back to pre-invasive algae habitation. So as you can see throughout the years, in Figure 5, after 35 months, the invasive mudweed is being outcompeted by the native algae. Further investigation should be done to determine if this has resulted in greater native biodiversity, but with the restoration of a reef to this level and the reestablishment of the native algae, it can be assumed that natural processes are beginning to take hold once again. The investment made in community-based restoration combines the socioeconomic outcomes with the ecological outcomes of a restoration project and produces outcomes that reach far beyond the initial study area. In this case study, the island of Oahu as a whole now has a trained force of individuals that can remediate other community reefs of the mudweed, and the lessons learned on this project were able to be shared through existing cultural social pipelines in addition to the scientific literature, thus increasing the reach that this project has to incorporate as many of the community members as possible. And finally, at the same time, a cultural reconnection with the resource has been completed, allowing this community full access to the cultural ecosystem services that humans desire. In conclusion, our reefs are experiencing drastic effects from climate change. Massive amounts of biodiversity loss is occurring on these reefs. Artificial reefs are touted as a way to increase that biodiversity. However, it is our belief that the cons far outweigh the pros when it comes to introducing novel and sterile structures into established ecosystems. Either by promoting the spread and density of invasive species or damaging native systems and organisms, artificial reefs have been seen to cause damages to the very systems they were touted to enhance. By ignoring the cultural significance of these habitats that they are trying to mimic, key cultural ecosystem services are being lost. The knowledge and continuing care that a community provides a resource even after the life of a restoration project is also lost. For these reasons, artificial structures should not be used to create oceanic habitat.